Hi, James Hardiman here, and I'm making this short video to bring to people's attention something really shocking that I discovered a couple of months ago, which is that our doctors, our health practitioners, our governments, people who give us dietary advice, nutritional advice, have been getting it not just wrong but disastrously wrong for about 50 years. Now that sounds a pretty tall order, especially coming from someone who, if you're looking at the video, if you know me, knows that clearly there's something wrong in my dietary life because I'm pretty overweight, I'm obese. Somebody gave me a book, or recommended me a book, and I read the book and it opened up a new world which I've been researching furiously for 8 weeks, and just want to tell you about, to give you an opportunity to learn some quite shocking facts yourself about how our diets are damaging us and what we can do about it. So the thing that they got wrong is the idea of the low-fat diet, the idea that dietary fat is bad for us. It turns out dietary fat is not bad for us at all. It's actually very necessary. And getting that thing about whether or not dietary fat is bad for us, getting that wrong led to all sorts of circumstances which have been a disaster. But let's start off with how they got it wrong. Back in the middle of the last century, sort of around about the 1960s or so, health authorities in the United States got terribly worried by what they saw as a sudden surge of heart disease, people dying of heart disease, and they looked at the statistics. And whereas before pretty few people had died of heart disease, all of a sudden loads of people were dying from heart disease, and they got really worried about it, and they set out to find out why. Now here was the first mistake. Actually, there was not an epidemic of heart disease, they just read the statistics wrong. And here's how they did that. In the early part of the 20th century, and actually for a long time before that, the average life expectancy of a white American male in New York City was 49 years old, and what they mostly died of was infectious diseases, things like polio and TB and cholera and stuff like that. But as you're probably aware, we learnt about antibiotics and got good with public health and sanitation systems and so forth, and we cleared up a huge number of infectious diseases. So that within 20 years, people weren't dying at age 49, they were living until age 65. And here's the thing, everyone dies of something, and if you've cleared up infectious diseases and people are living longer, wonderful, and then they're going to die of something else. And what they were dying of is the beginnings of diseases of old age, degenerative diseases, and heart disease was one of those. But there was another factor as well. If you're a doctor and you certify the cause of death, there is apparently, I didn't know about this, but there is apparently an internationally acknowledged list of causes of death that you can write down. And until 1965, ischemic heart disease wasn't actually on that list. So prior to 1965, if you died of ischemic heart disease, they couldn't write down heart disease because it wasn't on the list. There's a different sort of heart disease which came in around the 1920s, but also it was a fairly new medical field, heart disease, so it wasn't diagnosed particularly well. So here was the first mistake. There wasn't a surge in heart disease. So that when they went to look for the cause of heart disease, they probably weren't going to come up with the right answer because there wasn't a surge in heart disease. But anyway, they did go look. And there was a very influential man called Axel Keys. He was a medical doctor, he was an academic researcher, and he was an influential nutritionist. He was so influential that I used to be a soldier, and in the field we were given little cardboard boxes of food, of rations, and they were called C rations, and the C in the British Army stood for compact. Well, in American soldiers they get K rations, and the K stands for Keys, as in Axel Keys. He designed those. And Axel Keys got into his head the notion that dietary fat was the cause of heart disease, and he went out to see if he could prove that. And he had this idea that if he could look at what different nations ate and he could look at the rate of heart disease that different nations had, and if he could plot those on a graph and find some sort of correlation, then he would have proved his point. Well, there's another problem there, and I'll explain that in a minute, but there is an awful lot of bad science that's particularly given to us in newspaper articles and news articles on the TV, and I'll teach you in a minute how to find those, how to note them. Anyway, so what Axel Keys did was he went and looked at the statistics for death from heart disease in a lot of different nations. Now we already know, don't we, from what I've just said, that statistics for heart disease are not very good. They were not very good in America, and America was probably one of the most advanced societies. So that once you start looking at other countries, the statistics for death by heart disease weren't that good. So one set of his data wasn't very good. The other thing he looked at was what people ate. Well, think about it. If you wanted to know what a whole nation eats, how would you find that information? Nowadays we'd probably go and look on the internet, but we're talking about the 1950s, 1960s. There was no internet. What Keys did was he looked at economic statistics. What does a nation grow? What does it produce itself? What does it import? What does it export? And if you do a simple arithmetic around those, what you're left with must be what they eat. Well, not necessarily. They might be feeding it to the dog, they might be feeding it to the cat. We don't know how much gets wasted. But anyway, that was the data he took. So he's got two sets of data. What nations eat, and we know that that was pretty dodgy data. The data about death from cardiovascular disease, and we know that that was pretty dodgy data. And he plotted all those on a graph and looked at the graph, and what he got was a lot of spots all over the place which proved precisely nothing. So he thought to himself, well, probably the data from that particular nation wasn't very good data, so I'll take that out. And he kept doing that and kept doing that until eventually he got a line on the graph. He started off with 22 nations, and by the time he got a line on his graph, he got 7 nations. Now, talk to any scientist and they will tell you that that is bad science. If you do some research and get data that doesn't prove what you're hoping it would prove, then your research has just proved that your hypothesis was false. So let's just take a moment, do a little tiny piece of scientific education here. The notion in science is that you get an idea in your head, and we call that a hypothesis. So Axel Keys had this hypothesis that dietary fat caused heart disease, and you then go and do some research to test your hypothesis to see if it's true. Well, he did the research and it came back showing that his hypothesis was false. So he just played with the data and played with the data and played with the data until it came out to be true. And then, because he was that sort of person, he was very influential, he talked well, he talked to a lot of people, and he persuaded the world that dietary fat was bad for you and we should go for low-fat diets. Now, it's a much, much longer story than this, and there will be all sorts of references on the website that this video appears in where you can go and look this up. But that's the basic idea. So, what happens next? Well, the food industry got the idea that they could make a lot of money if they could process food. You know, if you grow an apple, and I grow an apple and this person grows an apple, how are you going to choose between this apple and that apple? But if I can somehow process this apple and tell you that this apple is much, much healthier than that apple, or much, much tastier, or much, much, much better for you, I can advertise this, I can differentiate, I can add value to the apple, and I can sell you this apple over this apple, and I can probably charge you a lot more money for it. So the food industry got pretty excited about the notion of low-fat food because they found that they could process food, take the fat out, advertise it as low-fat food, and people would flock and buy it. But here's the problem. Fat is one of the things that makes food taste good. And if you take the fat out of the food, it tastes like not a lot, pretty bad. So you've got to do something to put the flavour in. You could put in some salt, and they put in quite a lot of salt, and we have some idea that salt is actually bad for our blood pressure. That's also another scientific fact that's not really proven, but we'll let that go for a moment. But the other thing you can put in is you can make it sweeter. And over 50 years they've been making food sweeter and sweeter and sweeter. First of all by putting sugar in it, but then something else happened. There was an awful lot of agricultural land in America, and one of the things that grows pretty well is corn, as in sweet corn. And the reason they call sweet corn is because it's sweet. And you can extract a syrup out of sweet corn which is sweeter than sugar. It's actually called high fructose corn syrup. Ordinary white sugar that you get in a bowl to put in your tea is a mixture of glucose and fructose, around about half and half. Fructose is much sweeter than sucrose. Sucrose really doesn't taste all that much of anything. High fructose corn syrup is got more fructose than sucrose, and it's very sweet, and it's very cheap to produce, especially when you farm huge swathes of land in mid-America. So they produced high fructose corn syrup and they put it in everything. And there's no fat in high fructose corn syrup, so you could make a product that was absolutely loaded with sugar and you could label it no fat, zero fat, and people would think that it was healthy. There was an interesting piece of research done very recently, within the last few months, in the University of Glasgow, when they took so-called health drinks, fruit drinks that were labelled counts as one of your 5 a day, and they would take those around the streets and they get people to taste them and get people to guess how many teaspoonfuls of sugar were in them. And the one that really caught my attention and horrified me was pomegranate juice. Somehow we had this notion that pomegranate's a strange fruit and it's very good for you, and it probably is. But this pomegranate juice was quite sweet. If you just take pomegranate off the tree and eat it, it's not that sweet. So they sweetened it, and people would guess that a glass of pomegranate juice would have 4 teaspoons of sugar in it. No, it had 22 teaspoons of sugar in it. So what's the problem with all this sugar? Well, one of the things that they were hoping when they started recommending low-fat diets is that people would stop dying of heart disease. What happened, however, is that the rates of obesity went up, the rates of cardiovascular disease went up, the rates for type 2 diabetes went up, and something that we've only just started to realise, the rates of Alzheimer's disease has shot up too. How does this happen? Well, along with this worry about low-fat diet comes a worry about cholesterol, and we all know, don't we, that cholesterol is bad. And so a lot of doctors have taken to handing out drugs called statins, pretty much like Smarties. Statins are very cheap and they will lower your cholesterol, and we all know that cholesterol is bad, so it needs to be lowered, doesn't it? No. Cholesterol is not bad. Cholesterol is part of your body system. It takes energy, it takes nutrients around your body. Your brain in particular needs cholesterol. So where does the idea that cholesterol is bad come from? Well, you probably know that there are 2 sorts of cholesterol: HDL, high density lipoprotein, and LDL, low density lipoprotein. And if you've studied this a bit, you probably know that actually HDL is good and it's LDL which is the bad cholesterol. Well, that's kind of true. HDL cholesterol is definitely good, and your body definitely needs it. To just say that LDL cholesterol is bad is also missing the point. LDL cholesterol comes in little particles and it drifts around the bloodstream in these little particles, and some of the particles are very tiny and others are pretty big and fluffy. Now the big and fluffy ones are not a problem. They drift around your system, no problem at all. It's the little tiny ones that are a problem, and they're a problem because they lodge in the little gaps, the little irregularities inside your blood vessels, and they can harden your blood vessels. But now here's the key. The big fluffy LDL particles come from eating meat and fat and oil. It's the little hard ones that come from eating carbohydrates, come from food sources, come from sugar in particular. So that is a severe problem. Now, just want to talk a little bit about diabetes. I've got type 2 diabetes. Actually, it's sort of under control at the moment. We all think that there are two types of diabetes. They're now talking about three types of diabetes. If you go to Google and just Google type 3 diabetes, you'll get a lot of hits. Diabetes is all about insulin, and insulin is an incredibly important hormone in your system. It's to do with the flow of energy in your system. Insulin is the signal to your cells to take up energy. If you even think about eating something, your brain goes, it's about to eat something, there is going to be sugar in the blood. Sugar in the blood is not a good thing. We will release some insulin now before we even start eating, so that we can get rid of that sugar out of the blood straight away. As soon as you begin to eat, more insulin gets released. And the insulin is a signal to all of your cells to take up the sugar, the energy that's in your food. So it's a signal to your muscle cells, whether it's the muscles of your legs and arms, your body, or your lungs, or your heart, or whatever, that says, here comes some energy, take that up. But it's also a signal to your fat cells to take up energy. And the way the system should work is that food comes in, some of it gets used straight away, there are muscles that are working that need it straight away, and all the rest gets put into your fat cells pretty quickly. And then in the space between meals, what happens is that as your blood sugar levels go down, the energy in your muscles goes down, they signal that they want some more energy back, and the process reverse, it comes out of your fat cells, goes around your system, done. The problem is that we're eating so much sugar that the system just gets worn out. You get what's called insulin resistance. Now here's the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes. If you've got type 1, your pancreas just doesn't produce insulin, you're in big trouble most of your life, and most of your life you're injecting insulin, and not all that many people have got that. Type 2 diabetes is where the insulin receptors in your cells start to get worn out. And the ones that get worn out first are the ones in the muscles, which means that those cells are resistant to the effect of insulin. This means that the muscles don't take up the nutrients in the bloodstream, and they get tired. And that tiredness gets signaled throughout your body, it gets signaled to your brain, and your brain goes, oh, we're hungry because we don't have enough energy, so we'll eat some food. And the food goes into the bloodstream, the blood sugar levels go up, the body fires off a load more insulin, but the muscles are still not responding. So what happens here is you're tired, your body knows you need to eat because you're tired, and you eat, but the energy you get from the food doesn't go to the muscles because they're insulin resistant. Where does it go to? It goes to the fat cells. So what happens is, because you're insulin resistant, you're hungry all the time, and every time you eat, the energy doesn't go to your muscles, it goes to your fat cells, so you get fatter and fatter and fatter. Why don't obese people just carry on getting massiver and massiver and massiver? Some do. You occasionally see television programs about somebody who's 50 stone or something like that, but most obese people get to a certain weight and don't get heavier. It's happened to me. It's not a weight that I'm proud of, it's not a weight that's any use to me, but it doesn't seem to me that I get any heavier. Why not? Because after a while the fat cells get insulin resistant too. So that's a big problem, and the way around it, we have discovered, is to get off of the low fat diet and get onto a high fat diet, cut down on the carbohydrates. There are only three major food groups, what they call macronutrient groups, which are protein, fat and carbohydrate. And whatever you've got on your plate, there is some proportion that's protein, some proportion that's fat, and some proportion that's carbohydrate. What you need to do is make sure you've got enough protein. There's not much scientific argument about protein. You certainly need some, you don't need vast amounts. The argument is about the balance between fat and carbohydrate, and the answer is having cereal with fruit on it and a sprinkling of sugar and milk, which kind of looks like it ought to be healthy, we've been taught for 50 years it's healthy, is poison. Have bacon and eggs instead, and then preferably fry the bacon in butter. So what's type 3 diabetes? Well, one of the things that's been discovered is that the brain produces insulin, and the brain, amongst all parts of your body, needs energy more than any other. And your brain can become insulin resistant too. Now, the brain normally runs on glucose going around the system, and it absorbs that energy and away it goes. But if it becomes insulin resistant, then the brain doesn't get the food that it needs and it begins to die. So type 3 diabetes is what they're calling Alzheimer's disease, and there is something that you can do about that, and I'll get to that in just a moment, but I want to go back and do just a tiny bit more scientific teaching. We're all used to seeing articles in the newspaper and on the TV and on the internet news that says research has shown that coffee is bad for you, coffee is good for you, red wine is good for you, red wine is bad for you. I just want to give you a tiny piece of education that will allow you to judge those news articles. And there is a key word to look for, and it's a long word, and it's epidemiological. What an epidemiological study is what Ansel Keys did. You say to yourself, I wonder what the men in China eat, and I wonder what the incidence of heart disease is in men in China. I wonder what the men in America eat, and I wonder what the incidence of heart disease in men in America is. So you go out and you do a big study, and nowadays the data's there, so you can go and do the study, and what you discover is that Chinese people eat very little dairy food, and their rates of heart disease are about half of those of American men who eat quite a lot of dairy food. What happens next is that the newspaper article says, therefore, dairy food is bad for you. Well, that therefore is wrong. There is no therefore. Just because we've seen they don't eat dairy food, they don't get heart disease, they do eat dairy food, they do get heart disease, this is called correlation. There is a correlation. What we haven't proved is causation. We have not proved that dairy food gives you heart disease. What this study has given us is a hypothesis. It may be, it just may be that dairy food is bad for you and gives you heart disease, but it's not proven. This is an epidemiological study, and particularly newspapers and news reporters very often stick the word therefore in there, and it doesn't belong. So if you ever read a study that says these people do this and they have that, and these people don't do this and they don't have that, therefore, cross out the therefore. It's not proven. Oh, and by the way, there's something else interesting here. It is certainly the case that Chinese men have something like 50% rate of cardiovascular disease compared with American men, but they do have 6 times the rate of stroke. And of course, we haven't proven that not having dairy food gives you stroke, but you could just as easily make that false assumption. So here's something that I really want to get over to you. Look for the word epidemiological, and when it does, alarm bells ring, and if you're reading a news report that's got the word therefore in it, cross the word therefore out, unless you see that they've done really, really serious scientific research. Okay, last piece of my rant. I now want to talk about something called ketones and a ketogenic diet. A lot of doctors get this wrong. There is a state that your body can get into called ketosis, and ketosis happens when particularly when people are on a starvation diet, but it doesn't have to be on a starvation diet. If your body is in a state of ketosis, all that tells you is that your body is burning fat for energy. Now you have to look at me. I could run on fat for an awful long time, provided I could get my body into a state of ketosis. A lot of doctors will tell you ketosis is a really bad thing, you'll die of ketosis. No, that is completely and utterly wrong. They are confusing ketosis with ketoacidosis. Ketoacidosis is a state that type 1 diabetics get into if they're not taking their insulin, and it really is dangerous and you really can die of it. But unless you're type 1 diabetic refusing to take your insulin, you're not going to get ketoacidosis. Ketosis is a state that the human body is used to running in. Human beings have been around for something like 4 million years. We've only been farming for about 10,000 years. We've only been eating carbohydrates for about 10,000 years. And there are still groups of humans on this earth who don't eat any carbohydrates. Just think for a moment about the Inuit people. The people that I was taught to call Eskimos when I grew up, but the ones who live in igloos and live off of seal meat up in the Arctic. You have to ask yourself, how many fruit trees are around just outside their igloos when they come out? Where do they get their fruit and vegetables from? They don't. They live on seal meat. They live on fatty seal meat all year round, and they've been doing it for thousands, hundreds of thousands, probably millions of years, and doing just fine. But you don't have to go that extreme. People like the Maasai warriors on the plains of Africa mainly eat fatty meat. They might find a bit of fruit or a bit of root that they can gather from time to time, but they live mostly on fatty meat. And for the majority of the 4 million years before human beings invented farming, they lived mostly on fatty meat, and they did okay. While they were doing it, their bodies were running mainly on ketones rather than glucose, because there wasn't a lot of glucose around. My friend JP has got a car that runs on dual fuel. He can put in LPG, liquid petroleum gasoline, or he can put in diesel, I think, ordinary diesel. And he's just got a switch. You can flick the switch to run on LPG. LPG is cheaper than diesel, but you can't get it that much. So if he's running low on LPG and there are no LPG filling stations around, he flicks the switch and runs on gasoline or diesel. Well, our bodies are kind of similar. We can run on glucose or we can run on ketones. And the way we flip the switch is we just cut down on the carbohydrates a lot. Now, there is a condition that's called carbohydrate intolerance. You've probably come across people who have celiac disease. They're intolerant of wheat and gluten. Well, people become intolerant, and actually type 2 diabetes is a form of intolerance of carbohydrates. And there are different scales of carbohydrate intolerance, and there are things you can do to damage your body even more and make it even more carbohydrate intolerant, and there are things you can do to make it less carbohydrate intolerant. But depending on how carbohydrate intolerant you are, if you cut down the carbohydrates to within your tolerance level, then your body will go, okay, I'll stop trying to burn carbohydrates and I'll burn fat instead. And you go into this state of ketosis, and the fuel that flows around your system is ketones, not glucose. Now, here's an interesting thing. As far as we're aware, there is no such thing as ketone intolerance. So when you're in ketosis, your body runs much better. One of the things that runs much better is this. Because if you've got type 3 diabetes, if your brain is insulin resistant, then your brain is being starved because it can't take up glucose. But once you're running on ketones, the ketones go through there and there is no barrier to the ketones. And ask anybody who's been on a ketogenic diet, they might find it's a bit tough, but the brain goes sharp immediately. And I recently read a study where they took I think it was 60 people who were in early stage Alzheimer's. They put them on a ketogenic diet for 6 months, and magic, they were cured. You will also see on the page in which this video appears further down, there's a video about a woman doctor in Florida whose husband had bad Alzheimer's, and she fed him on coconut oil. Now, coconut oil is a quick way of getting ketones into your system. When you digest coconut oil, bam, you've got ketones in your system. Within a few weeks, his Alzheimer's disease was starting to get better. So that's the end of my rant. If any of this has rung any sort of bells at all, please look at all the other information that's on this web page. If you need to get into the science in great depth, if you're a medical doctor and this is news to you and you think, maybe this guy might just be right, go and look up the works of Gary Taubes. There are two books. One is a very skinny book. Well, it's not that skinny. I read it 1.5 times on a plane between Gatwick and Orlando. But Gary's also written a great big stonking book. In England it's called The Diet Delusion. In America it's called Good Calories, Bad Calories. And it gives you all the science behind this. Please, please go and look at it. There have been no scientific pieces of research done that show that fat is bad for you. You can read study after study after study after study that was done with thousands of people over long periods of time, looking to see that fat is bad for you, and in every case the studies prove nothing. What's happened is that people have become so convinced that dietary fat is bad for you that they throw the results of those research away and just go, well, we must have done it wrong. No, you did it right. Dietary fat is not bad for you, it's necessary for you. So please go and look at some of these articles, read some of these books, because we're being fed bad information. There are lots of other videos, and if you want to know more, we're happy for you to get in contact with us. That's it for now. Thank you for watching.